Hey there. Tonight, we slip past the lace curtains and the wedding silver into the quiet, complicated heart of a Victorian marriage, the world of the Victorian wife. The woman at the center of the household, mistress of the keys and the linen and the long dinner table, the angel of the home that every poem of the age adored. Tonight you become her. The new bride in the white veil, the young wife learning the rules of a house that is now her whole kingdom and her whole confinement. And, as you're about to discover, the moment a Victorian woman said, "I will," she very nearly stopped existing at all. Before we begin, take a slow breath, and if you genuinely enjoy these quiet journeys into the past, go ahead and like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly want to. No pressure here ever. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight, and what time it is for you. I always love picturing all of us, scattered across the world, settling in under the blankets together, drifting off to the same old stories. Now dim the lights. Sink into your pillows. Let your shoulders go heavy. And let's step gently into the life of a Victorian wife, a life that began, for nearly every woman of the age, on the single most important and most irreversible day she would ever know. Congratulations. You have just been married. The good news, you have done the one thing your entire upbringing has pointed you toward, the thing your mother prayed for and your every accomplishment was polished to achieve. You have become a wife, and with it, a respectable woman with a settled place in the world. The bad news, in the eyes of the law you have, as of this morning, more or less ceased to exist as a separate person at all. For in the strange arithmetic of Victorian marriage, two became one, and the one, it turned out, was him. Let us begin where your new life begins, with that astonishing legal vanishing act, because it is the foundation under everything else, and most brides walked into it with very little idea of what it truly meant. Under the old principle the lawyers called coverture, a wife was covered by her husband, folded into his legal person, absorbed, so that in the eyes of the law the two of you were now a single individual, and that individual was, in every practical sense, your husband. You could not own property in your own name. Whatever you had brought to the marriage, your money, your inheritance, the little fortune your father may have settled on you, became his the moment the ring went on, to do with as he pleased. If you worked, your wages were his. If someone left you a legacy, it was his. You could not sign a contract, could not sue at a court, could not make a will without his permission. You did not even, in the fullest sense, own the clothes on your back or the body inside them. You had, in a single morning, gone from a daughter to a wife, and in the process you had handed over very nearly everything you were, to a man you may have known for only a handful of chaperone months. And so the marriage you are about to begin is not, whatever the poets say, a partnership of equals. It is closer to a kind of benevolent ownership, in which your husband holds almost all the power, and you are expected to find your happiness, your purpose, and your entire identity inside the space he allows you. If he is kind, and many were, that space could be warm and wide and genuinely loving. If he is not, there is dreadfully little you can do about it, for the law and the church and society all stand behind him, and almost none of them stand behind you. You have, this morning, made the most important gamble of your life, and you made it, as nearly every woman did, with your eyes half closed. And the dependence reached right down into the smallest corners of daily life, into your very pocket. For a wife of the comfortable classes had, in the ordinary way, no money that was truly her own, no wage, no income she controlled, nothing but what her husband chose to give her. The luckier had what was called pin money, an allowance settled on the wife for her personal spending, her clothes and her small charities and her private wants. But even that flowed from him, by his arrangement, and a less generous or more controlling husband might give little, or grudgingly, or attach to it 100 small humiliations. Picture the position of a grown woman, the mistress of a household, the mother of his children, who must go to her husband and ask for the money to buy a new gown, or a gift for her own sister, or whatever small thing she desired, and who must justify it, and might be refused. The wife who had brought a fortune to the marriage could find herself, a few years on, obliged to beg her husband for a few pounds of what had once been entirely hers. It was a daily, grinding reminder of where the power truly lay, not in the great dramatic injustices, but in the small ordinary ones, the constant gentle necessity of asking a man's leave for the ordinary business of one's own life. A wife might rule a household of a dozen servants and command a great dinner table, and still not have, in her own right, the price of a pair of gloves. That was coverture, lived out not in the law books, but at the breakfast table, every single day. And consider how little you were truly allowed to know of the man before you bound your whole life to him. A respectable courtship was a chaperoned, formal, carefully supervised affair, conducted under the watchful eyes of mothers and aunts, with almost no opportunity for the two of you ever to be genuinely alone or genuinely honest. You met at balls and dinners and carefully arranged occasions. You exchanged the polished, guarded conversation that society permitted. You were never, before the wedding, to know him in any unguarded or intimate way at all. A young woman might accept a proposal and walk to the altar having spent, in total, only a handful of properly supervised hours in her future husband's company, knowing his fortune and his family and his manners, and almost nothing of his temper, his habits, his kindness, or his cruelty behind a closed door. You were choosing, in effect, a near stranger to hold near total power over the rest of your days, and you were choosing him largely on appearances, because appearances were nearly all you were allowed to see. Small wonder mothers fretted so over a daughter's match, and small wonder a good marriage was counted such a piece of luck, for luck, in no small measure, was exactly what it was. Then came the engagement, and with it the great labor of the trousseau, the bride's outfitting, the assembling of her whole new life in linen and lace. For months before the wedding, a bride and her mother and the dressmakers worked to prepare everything she would carry into her married home, the gowns for every occasion of her new station, the nightclothes and the underlinen, the household linens marked with her new initials, the whole trousseau that announced she was now a woman of substance crossing over into the married state. It was exciting, and it was a comfort, and it was also, if you looked at it sideways, a kind of packing up of a girl to be sent away forever, the careful preparation of everything she would need to begin a life from which there would be no real returning. And all the while the settlements were being drawn up by the fathers and the lawyers, the marriage made on paper as a transfer of property and expectation between two families, the bride's own fortune signed over into the arrangement that would, the next morning, cease to be hers at all. And you may wonder, lying there in the warm dark, why any woman would walk knowingly into so unequal a bargain, why she would not simply decline, and keep herself, and her property, and her freedom. The answer is that for most women there was, in truth, almost no real alternative at all. A respectable woman of your class could not have a career. The professions were closed to her, and to work for wages was to fall out of her station entirely. She could not, in most cases, live independently on her own. An unmarried woman remained under the authority and in the household of her father, and after him her brothers, a permanent dependent in someone else's home. To not marry was to face a future as the spinster aunt, the maiden sister, shuffled from one relative's household to another, useful and unpaid and faintly pitied, with no home of her own and no place that was truly hers, growing old on the charity of her family. The age even had a chilling phrase for the unmarried women who, as the century went on, came to outnumber the available husbands. It called them redundant, surplus, leftover, a social problem to be solved. So marriage was not, for most women, one option among many. It was the option, very nearly the only door out of perpetual dependence and into a household and a position and a purpose of one's own, even if that household was a cage, and that position was subordinate, and that purpose was to serve. A woman married because the alternative was to remain forever a child in someone else's house. Faced with that, the unequal bargain of the altar could look, to a sensible girl, very much like the best of a narrow set of choices. And so she took it, as nearly all of them did, and made the best of it she could. But let us not begin in gloom, for it is your wedding day, and you have a great deal of performing to do. The Victorian wedding was a glory of white, and you may thank the young queen herself for that, for it was Victoria's own white wedding dress, worn at her marriage to Albert, that helped fix the fashion for white that brides follow to this very day. And the white meant something. It was the color of purity, of innocence, of the unspotted maidenhood the bride was understood to be carrying, intact and unquestioned, to her husband as a kind of gift. The whole costume of the wedding, the white, the veil that was lifted only at the altar, the orange blossom that stood for chastity and fruitfulness both, was a piece of symbolism announcing exactly what the bride was supposed to be: pure, untouched, ready to be transformed by marriage from a maiden into a wife. And under all the joy and the flowers and the family pride, the wedding day carried, for the bride herself, a strange undertow of loss, for it was the day she left her childhood home forever. She had been, until that morning, a daughter in her father's house. She would leave the church a wife in her husband's, and there was no going back. She was saying goodbye to her mother, to her sisters, to her own girlhood bedroom, to the only life and the only family she had ever known, and going off with a man she might still barely know, to a house and a life that were strange to her. The Victorians felt this keenly, and their weddings carried, amid the celebration, a real note of solemn parting, even of grief. The bride weeping as she said her farewells, the mother weeping to lose a daughter, the whole family marking a real ending even as they marked a beginning. For a girl, marriage was the great rupture of her life, the single day that cut it cleanly in two, and she walked toward it in white, smiling and frightened, leaving one whole self behind on the threshold and stepping out to become another, with very little idea of what was truly waiting on the other side. So you stand in your white gown and your veil, the orange blossom in your hair, and you make your vows before God and your family, to love, to honor, and, that one heavy word the husband's vow conveniently left out, to obey. You promised it quite clearly, there at the altar, in front of everyone. Obey. And the whole of your married life will be a long working out of exactly what that word is going to mean under your particular roof. For obey was not an empty piece of ceremony. It described, quite plainly, the real shape of the thing. The husband chose where you would live, and you lived there. The husband decided how the money was spent, and what society you would keep, and how the children would be raised and schooled, and you fell in with it. The husband's word, on any matter of consequence, was simply final, and a wife who set herself openly against it was held to be failing in her most basic duty. Some husbands wore the authority lightly, and shared it freely, ruling their homes as gentle partners. Some wielded it like a rod. But it was there, in every marriage, the plain fact at the bottom of everything, that one of you had promised to obey, and one of you had not, and the law and the church and the whole weight of the age stood ready to enforce the difference. You had said the word at the altar, in your white gown, before everyone you loved. Now you would spend the rest of your life discovering what it cost. And then the wedding breakfast, and the speeches, and the cake, and the going away, and then, as the day folds toward evening, the part of the business that no one, in all your careful upbringing, ever actually explained to you. The wedding night? For here is one of the quiet cruelties of your century's idea of a respectable woman, that she was to be kept perfectly innocent, perfectly ignorant, right up until the very night that innocence ended. A well-bred girl was told essentially nothing about what marriage would physically involve. The subject was unmentionable and delicate, not to be discussed, and so a great many brides went to their wedding nights with only the haziest and most frightening notion of what was about to happen to them, sometimes genuinely shocked, occasionally convinced something had gone terribly wrong. Whatever vague counsel a mother managed to stammer out tended to amount to little more than the famous, weary advice to endure it quietly, to lie still, to think of something else, to consider it a duty owed rather than a pleasure shared. It is a hard way to begin the most intimate partnership of your life, in the dark, uninformed, and instructed chiefly to submit. It is worth dwelling a moment on just how complete that ignorance was meant to be, because it is one of the things about your century hardest for a later age to credit. The ideal Victorian bride was not merely uninformed. She was prized precisely for her innocence, her purity, her total unworldliness in these matters, which were taken as the very proof of her virtue. To have known anything, to have shown any curiosity, would have been a stain. And so the knowledge that might have spared her fear and confusion was deliberately withheld, generation after generation, mother declining to tell daughter what her own mother had declined to tell her, the whole subject sealed behind a wall of delicacy. Medical men of the age even lent their authority to the comforting notion that a truly respectable woman felt little or no desire of her own, that passion was a coarse male trait from which the pure wife was happily exempt, and that her part was simply to receive her husband's attentions with patient, dutiful good grace. So a bride was sent into the most physical intimacy of her life, not only ignorant of the facts, but actively taught that to feel anything but mild endurance would be unwomanly. It is a strange and rather sad way to have arranged things, and it laid a chill over the marriage bed of many a Victorian couple that neither of them had the words to name. Then came the honeymoon, the wedding tour, and here at least there was something to look forward to, for the newly married couple would go away together, often for weeks, sometimes for months, traveling to the coast, or to the continent, or among the lakes and mountains, in the first real privacy either of them had ever been permitted. For a fortunate bride it was the beginning of genuine intimacy and affection, the slow getting to know of the stranger she had married, in pleasant places far from the watching families. For an unlucky one it could be a dawning horror, weeks of forced closeness with a man she was discovering too late she could not like, and nowhere to go, and no one to tell, and the whole rest of her life now stretching out on the far side of it. The wedding tour was the hinge of a woman's whole existence. the door swinging shut behind the girl she had been, and opening onto the wife she would now have to be, for better or for worse, until death. And then you came home, to the house that was now, in some sense, your domain, and in every legal sense his, to begin the real work of being a wife. And here a curious thing awaited many a new bride, that for all the years of preparation, she was often startlingly unready for the actual running of a household. She had been raised to be accomplished, charming, decorative, marriageable. She could sing and sketch and speak a little French and dance a quadrille and embroider a cushion, and she might not have the first practical idea how to order a week's meals, or what a leg of mutton ought to cost, or how to check the household accounts, or how to manage a cook twice her age, who knew perfectly well that the new young mistress did not know what she was about. The accomplishments of the marriage market and the competences of the married state were two quite different things, and a great many brides had been thoroughly drilled in the first, and left almost wholly ignorant of the second. So the early married months could be a steep and anxious climb, the young wife learning on the job, under the watchful and not always kindly eyes of her servants and her mother-in-law and her husband, the vast practical business of running a home, which is precisely why the fat books of household management sold so well, and why one young wife's manual on exactly that subject made her name immortal. The bride who had spent her girlhood learning to be chosen now had to learn, in a hurry and rather alone, how to be in charge. And submit, in a sense, is precisely what the law now expected of you, in this as in everything. For your body, having become in marriage a part of his legal person, was understood to be at your husband's disposal. The notion that a wife might refuse her husband, that there could even be such a thing as a wrong done to her within the marriage bed, had essentially no standing in the law of the age. You had consented, the reasoning ran, once and forever, on your wedding day. What followed was simply marriage. And so a Victorian wife had remarkably little say over the one matter that would shape her health, her body, and very possibly the length of her life, how often, and how soon, and how many times she would become a mother. Because that is what came next, again and again and again. Reliable means of preventing it were scarce, frowned upon, and largely unmentionable, and so for most wives marriage meant pregnancy, and then another, and another, a child every year or two stretching out across the whole of her fertile life. 6 children, 8, 10, 12. The great Victorian families ran long, and behind every one of those crowded family portraits stood a woman who had carried and borne each of those children through an age when childbirth itself was one of the most dangerous things a human being could do. There was no real pain relief for much of this century, no understanding of the infection that killed so many new mothers in the days after a birth, no safety net at all beyond luck and a doctor's unwashed hands. Each confinement was a genuine brush with death, faced not once, but over and over, year upon year. To be a Victorian wife was to spend your prime decades almost continuously pregnant, nursing, or recovering, and to face, each time, the real possibility that this birth would be the one you did not survive. Many did not. The phrase, "She died in childbed," tolls quietly through the family histories of the entire era. And the danger did not end when the child was safely born, for the children themselves died in numbers that would break a modern heart. Infant and childhood mortality in your century was appallingly high. It was a rare family indeed, at any level of society, that did not bury at least one small child, and many buried several. Fevers, infections, the childhood illnesses we now shrug off, the bad water, and the poor understanding of how disease spread, all of it took a steady, terrible toll, so that a Victorian mother lived under the constant shadow of the small coffin, the empty cot, the child who sickened in a week and was gone. She might bear 10 children and raise 6. She might lose a beloved baby, and a year later lose another. This was simply woven into the fabric of married life, an expected grief, and women bore it with a stoicism that can look, from a distance, almost like coldness, but was in truth a kind of armor worn over wounds that never really healed. The serene matron at the head of the family portrait had very often, behind that calm, a private litany of little graves. And the curious thing, given how much a wife's life was given over to childbearing, is how little of the daily raising of those children she actually did with her own hands, at least in a household of any comfort. The babies were given to a wet nurse, perhaps, and then to a nanny. The nursery was its own small kingdom up at the top of the house, ruled by the nurse, where the children lived their separate lives and were brought down, washed and brushed and on their best behavior, to spend a decorous hour with their parents in the afternoon or evening. A well-bred mother loved her children dearly, but she supervised their care more than she performed it, and a governess came in time to school the girls and the youngest boys, before the boys were sent away to school entirely. So the wife's bond with her children could be deep and real, and yet oddly formal, conducted at a slight remove, through nurses and schoolrooms and appointed hours. Another of the quiet paradoxes of her life, that the woman who risked death again and again to bring children into the world then handed their daily upbringing to others, as her station required, and loved them across that distance as best she could. And while your body did this enormous and dangerous work, your century paid you the most extraordinary compliments for it. For the Victorians built an entire cult around the married woman, an ideal so lofty and so suffocating that it is hard to know whether to be flattered or to flee. They called you the angel in the house, after a wildly popular poem of the age that enshrined the wife as a being of pure, selfless, gentle devotion, living only for her husband and children, asking nothing for herself, content to make the home a sweet still haven from the rough male world outside. You were to be the moral heart of the household, purer and finer than your husband. Your influence felt not through any power of your own but through the softening, civilizing effect of your goodness upon the men around you. It sounds lovely. It was also a cage built entirely of compliments, for the angel in the house had no needs, no ambitions, no anger, no self. She existed only for others, and a real woman who felt any of those forbidden things had to swallow them and keep smiling, because the ideal allowed her no room to be anything as inconvenient as a whole human being. This was the great doctrine of your age, separate spheres. The man's sphere was the world, work, money, politics, the public life of the nation. The woman's sphere was the home, and only the home. He went out into the rough business of living. You stayed in, and made the place he came back to. The thinking ran that this was not a demotion but an exaltation, that the home was a sacred place and you were its priestess, that in being shut out of the world you were in fact being protected from its coarseness, kept pure upon your domestic pedestal. A great Victorian thinker wrote a whole celebrated essay praising the wife as the queen of her household, the guiding moral spirit of her own gentle kingdom. And there is something genuinely beautiful in the ideal, if you do not look at it too hard. Look at it hard, though, and the pedestal turns out to be very small and very high, and to have no stairs down, a queen of a single set of rooms, who may never, ever leave them for the wider country where all the real power lies. And inside those rooms, you had a kingdom to run, for make no mistake, being the wife of a comfortable Victorian household was a genuine and demanding job, even if your century would never have dignified it with the word. You were the manager of a small and complicated enterprise. There were servants to hire, oversee, and discipline, and the running of servants was a delicate art in itself, a constant negotiation of authority and tact, for a badly managed household reflected directly upon you. The keeping of servants was, in fact, one of the defining labors and one of the perpetual headaches of a wife's life, so much so that the age talked endlessly of the servant problem as one of the great trials of respectable existence. You had to hire them, interviewing, taking up characters and references, choosing well, for a dishonest or idle or troublesome servant under your roof was your responsibility and your embarrassment. You had to train them in the exacting ways of your particular household, and oversee their endless work, and settle their disputes, and tend them when they were ill, and dismiss them when they failed, and find new ones when they left, and they did leave, forever giving notice for a better place, so that a wife might feel she had barely trained one housemaid before she was hunting for the next. You had to hold the line of authority firmly enough to be obeyed and graciously enough to be respected, neither too familiar nor too harsh, managing a household of people who lived under your roof and did your bidding, and yet were not your family, in a relationship that was intimate and hierarchical and fraught all at once. The mistress who could not manage her servants was pitied and a little despised. Her disordered household was taken as the plain evidence of her own incapacity. So a great part of a wife's daily mind was given over to this small kingdom of below stairs, the cook to be conferred with each morning over the day's meals, the housemaids to be set to their tasks, the whole human machinery of the home to be kept running smoothly and invisibly, so that her husband and her guests might enjoy the comfort of a well-run house without ever once seeing the labor, or the management of the labor, that produced it. It was real work, skilled work, unending work. And the age, of course, did not call it work at all. It simply called it being a good wife. There were the household accounts to keep, the menus to plan, the linen and the silver and the stores to inventory, the endless social calendar of calls and cards and dinners to choose and arrange. You carried the keys, the literal keys to the larder and the stores and the precious things, and the keys were a symbol of your office, the mark that you, and not the housekeeper and certainly not your husband, were the mistress of this house. An entire industry of advice sprang up to instruct you in it, fat books of household management that laid out, in exhaustive detail, how a wife was to run her home like a well-drilled regiment, one of which, as you'll hear tonight, was written by a young woman who became, on the strength of it, the most famous wife in England. But picture, for a moment, the very different life of a wife with no keys to carry and no servants to command, for the comfortable mistress with her household staff was only one kind of Victorian wife, and far from the most common. Down the long ladder of class, the working man's wife lived a married life of a wholly different and far harder shape. She had the same legal nothingness, the same near-yearly childbearing, the same husband set in authority over her, but none of the cushioning of money. She did her own cooking, her own washing in great steaming exhausting Mondays of laundry, her own scrubbing and mending and hauling of water and coal, while bearing and minding a house full of children in a few cramped rooms, very often with her husband's wages uncertain and the specter of real want never far from the door. And many such wives worked for pay on top of all of it, in the mills and factories, in other women's kitchens, taking in washing or sewing or lodgers, a double labor, paid drudgery piled on top of unpaid drudgery, with her earnings, like everything else, belonging in law to her husband. If he drank, if he was cruel, if he spent the family's bread money at the public house, she had even less recourse than her wealthier sisters, and a great deal further to fall. The angel in the house, the queen of her gentle kingdom, the lady of the keys, and the calling cards, all of that was the dream and the burden of the comfortable few. For the many, being a Victorian wife meant simply unending work, constant childbearing, and the daily struggle to keep a family fed and clothed and respectable on too little, under the same law that gave her husband everything and her almost nothing at all. So your days had their shape, and it was a busy one. The morning given to the management of the house, the conferences with the cook and the housekeeper, the ordering of the day. Then the calls, that intricate ritual of brief formal visits, paying and receiving, the leaving of cards with their corners precisely turned, the whole delicate social machinery by which a wife maintained her family standing in the neighborhood. And what a machinery it was! A whole silent language of pasteboard, governed by rules so intricate and so absurd that a wife could spend a real portion of her mind simply keeping them straight. You did not merely visit your acquaintances. You left your card, and the card itself spoke. A corner turned down meant you had called in person rather than sending a servant. The number of cards left, and whose, signaled exactly which members of a household you were acknowledging. To call and be told the lady was not at home might mean she was genuinely out, or might mean, perfectly politely, that she did not care to receive you, a snub delivered without a single rude word ever being spoken. There were rules for how soon you must return a call, and what admit if you delayed, and what admit if you returned it by card alone rather than in person. A new wife in a neighborhood had to be called upon by the established ladies before she existed socially at all, and woe betide her if she presumed to call first. The whole elaborate dance decided who was in and who was out, who was rising and who was being quietly dropped, and it was conducted entirely by women, the wives being the keepers and enforcers of their family's social standing. It was, in its way, a real and serious power, the power to admit or exclude, to make or unmake a family's place. But it was a power exercised over a kingdom no larger than a set of drawing rooms, with weapons no heavier than a calling card and a carefully timed "not at home." A wife could be a general in that war, and never once set foot beyond the parlor. The afternoon perhaps for the carriage, or for needlework, or for the children and their nursery, which you visited rather than ran, for a household of any pretension handed the daily labor of the children to a nurse and a governess. And then the evening, and its great recurring performance, the dinner. For entertaining was one of a wife's most important duties, and a successful dinner party, the food faultless, the table beautiful, the guests well matched, the conversation smooth, was a real accomplishment, and a real source of a husband's pride or his quiet humiliation. And the formal dinner was a minefield of its own particular rules, every one of which a good hostess had to navigate without a flicker. There was the agony of precedence, the strict order of social rank that decided who went in to dinner before whom, who sat where, who took whose arm, a hierarchy so precise and so jealously felt that to seat a guest below their proper station was a genuine insult that could sour a friendship. The hostess had to know, to the inch, the exact relative standing of every person at her table, and arrange the whole procession and seating accordingly, like a herald marshalling a coronation. There were the courses, marching out in their stately order, the bewildering array of glasses and silver, each piece for its appointed use. The rule that a lady divided her conversation evenly between the gentlemen on either side of her, turning from one to the other as the courses changed. The great moment when the hostess caught the eyes of the ladies and rose, sweeping them all out to the drawing-room, and leaving the gentlemen to their wine, and their cigars, and their coarser male talk. To preside over all of it with serene, effortless grace, never letting the strain show, was the mark of an accomplished wife. And running beneath the pleasure of it was a serious purpose, for a wife was, in a very real sense, one of her husband's chief assets in the world. His standing, his connections, the advancement of his career or his ambitions, depended in no small part on the social world she built and maintained around them both. A clever, charming, capable wife who entertained brilliantly and managed the family's social life with skill could open doors for her husband, smooth his path, knit the useful friendships, charm the important guests, and quietly advance his fortunes in 100 ways he could never have managed alone. In the political world especially, the great hostess was a power behind the scenes. Her dinner table and her drawing room, the place where careers were made and alliances were sealed. So the wife's social labor was not mere frivolity. It was, for an ambitious household, real and valuable work, perhaps the one arena where a woman's talents could shape events in the wider world, even if she could only do it through her husband, from behind the teapot, with no name of her own on any of it. It was influence without authority, power without title, the only kind, once again, that the age would let her have. You were the stage manager of it all, and the leading lady, too, expected to be charming and serene and effortless at the head of a table whose every detail you had spent the day arranging. And marriage changed even how you looked to the world, marked you visibly as a woman who had crossed over into the wedded state. There was the ring, of course, the plain gold band that announced you were a wife and another man's, never to be removed. But it went further than that. A married woman dressed differently from the fresh young girl she had been. She put away the white muslins and the simple styles of the unmarried miss, and took up the richer fabrics, the deeper colors, the more elaborate gowns and jewels appropriate to a matron of standing. She often took to wearing a cap indoors, that small frilled head covering that signaled a settled married woman rather than a girl on the marriage market. For the unmarried girl dressed to attract, to be chosen. The wife dressed to display her husband's status and her own respectability, having already been chosen, her work of attraction done. There was a whole grammar of it that every eye could read at a glance. This one a maiden still in the running, that one a matron safely settled. To become a wife was to step, visibly and permanently, out of one category of woman and into another, out of the bright anxious spring of the marriage market and into the long settled summer and autumn of the married state, with all its comforts and all its confinements, written plainly in the very clothes upon your back. And through all of it ran that one promised word, obey. The husband was, by law and by custom and by the plain teaching of the church, the head of the household, and a wife was expected to defer to him. His decisions were final. His authority over the family, the money, the children, the very arrangements of daily life, was near total. A good wife managed her husband, the wise old voices counseled, not by opposing him, heaven forbid, but by gentle influence, by tact, by making the thing she wanted seem like his own idea, by the soft arts of persuasion that were the only power the age permitted her. Open defiance was unthinkable. And behind the velvet of all this counsel sat a harder fact, that a husband's authority over his wife had real teeth in it. The law gave him sweeping power over her person. The old principle that a man might chastise his wife within bounds died slowly and informally rather than by any clean stroke. A husband could, in practice, confine his wife, control her movements, deny her access to her own children, and stand on the firm ground of his legal rights while he did it. For most wives, in most homes, it never came to that. But the power was there, always, an iron frame beneath the domestic comfort, and every wife knew, somewhere, that her happiness depended very largely on the character of the man she had married, because the law had handed him nearly all the cards. For the hardest truth of your married life is this: there was, for most of the century, very nearly no way out of it. Divorce, before the middle of the century, was so difficult and so ruinously expensive as to be impossible for all but a handful of the very rich, requiring, in effect, a private act of Parliament. And when the law was at last reformed and divorce brought within reach of more than the aristocracy, it arrived wearing a breathtaking double standard on its face. A husband could divorce his wife simply for her adultery, and that alone. A wife could not divorce her husband for his adultery, no matter how flagrant. She had to prove his adultery and something more, some additional cruelty or desertion, before the law would even consider freeing her. His unfaithfulness was a regrettable masculine weakness. Hers was a crime that struck at the very root of property and inheritance and the legitimacy of his heirs. And so a wife was held to a standard of fidelity her husband was quietly excused from, and bound, for richer for poorer, in sickness and in health, to a marriage she could almost never escape, whatever it became once the door had closed. For the double standard ran far deeper than the divorce courts. It was woven through the whole texture of married life. A husband who strayed, who kept a mistress, who visited the women of the town, who conducted his discreet affairs, was committing, in the eyes of his world, a forgivable masculine indulgence, the sort of thing a wife was expected to know nothing of and, if she did know, to bear in dignified silence. To make a fuss, to be jealous, to demand fidelity in return for her own, was thought almost vulgar, a failure of the serene forbearance the good wife was supposed to embody. Meanwhile, the very same society that winked at his wandering would have destroyed her utterly for a fraction of it. A single proven infidelity on the wife's part was social annihilation, the ruin of her name, the loss of her children, the end of everything, because her body was the guarantee of his bloodline, and a doubt cast over the legitimacy of his heirs struck at the root of property itself. So she kept her side of the bargain absolutely, whatever it cost her, while he was free to keep his as loosely as he liked. And the wife who suspected, who lay awake knowing, who caught the scent of another woman's world on the husband the law had made her master, she had no remedy at all but to look away, and smile at his dinner table, and be the angel of the house regardless. It was perhaps the loneliest clause in the whole long contract of Victorian marriage. There was, too, a quiet pressure on the wife to be the keeper of the marriage's whole moral temperature, to manage not just the household, but the husband himself, to be the soothing, civilizing, gently improving influence that the age believed a good woman naturally exerted on a man. If he drank too much, kept bad company, neglected his duties, lost his temper, it was somehow understood to be partly her work to draw him back, by patience and sweetness and the steady example of her own goodness, never by confrontation. The wife was held responsible, in 100 unspoken ways, for the moral health of a man over whom she had no actual authority whatsoever. If the marriage was unhappy, the world was quick to wonder what the wife had done, or failed to do, to keep her husband content. It was an exhausting and unfair burden, this expectation that she would manage by charm and virtue a man the law had set entirely above her. And yet it was, for many wives, the only real influence they had, and they learned to wield the soft arts of it with great skill, because the soft arts were all the age would let them carry. And if she did somehow break free, if she fled an unbearable marriage, or was cast out of one, the cruelest blow of all was usually waiting, her children. For under the law a father's right to his children was nearly absolute, and a mother's was almost nothing. A man could take his children from their mother entirely, forbid her to see them, raise them to forget her, and the law would back him to the hilt. A woman who left her husband, for whatever reason, risked losing her children forever, with no right even to visit them. It was this monstrous arrangement that one wronged Victorian woman fought, publicly and at terrible cost to her own reputation, until the law was at last softened to grant mothers even the smallest foothold of right over their own young children. But for most of the century, the thread hung over every unhappy wife like a sword, that the price of freedom was her sons and daughters, and that the marriage held her not only by law and by money, but by the deepest love she had. And yet, and hold on to this as a small warm light in a dark chapter, the century did not end as it began. Across the long reign, slowly, against fierce resistance, the iron frame of the law was filed away, reformed by hard-won reform, by the patient labor of brave women and a handful of sympathetic men. First came a small crack in the wall of a father's absolute power, a law that granted a mother at least the right to petition for custody of her youngest children, the first time the law had admitted she had any claim on her own babies at all. Then came the reform that brought divorce, for the first time, within reach of more than the very rich. Flawed and unequal as it was a door where before there had been a blank wall. And then, late in the century, came the great change, the laws that at last allowed a married woman to own property in her own name, to keep her own earnings, her own inheritance, her own money, as her own, separate from her husband, no longer swallowed by him the moment she wed. With the stroke of those reforms, coverture itself, that ancient principle that had made a wife vanish into her husband, was at last broken. A wife became, in the eyes of the law, a person again, able to own, to keep, to hold something that was hers. It had taken most of the century, and it came too late for the millions of women whose married lives were already spent under the old harsh rules. But it came. The young wife of the century's end stood on ground her grandmother could only have dreamed of, and the long slow work of making a wife a person rather than a possession had truly begun. There is a quiet heroism in that, threaded through all the sorrow, that the women of your age did not simply endure the cage, but, generation by generation, bent its bars. So you smile at the head of your beautiful dinner table, the angel of your house, the queen of your gentle kingdom, and you are bound into it more completely than any words at the altar could convey, your property his, your body his, your children his, your only sphere these rooms, your only power the soft art of influence, your only exit a scandal so ruinous it would cost you nearly everything. And the strange thing, the thing that makes your century so hard to judge from a distance, is that a great many Victorian wives were, by their own account, genuinely happy inside all of this, that love grew in these confined gardens, real and deep and lasting, that many husbands were tender and many marriages were true partnerships in everything but the law, that women found enormous meaning in their homes, and their children, and the small queendoms they ruled. The cage was real. So sometimes was the contentment inside it. Both things are true at once, and that is the puzzle of the Victorian wife. And there was one more passage that awaited a great many wives, the one the marriage vows named so lightly and meant so heavily, till death us do part. For women often married men older than themselves, and men's lives were hard used, and so a wife stood a fair chance of ending her days as a widow. And Victorian widowhood was a whole elaborate world of its own, governed by rules as strict as any that bound the wife. The age had turned mourning into an art and very nearly a profession, and the Queen herself, sunk in her famous decades of grief for her lost Albert, set the tone for the entire nation. A widow was expected to disappear into mourning by stages, each minutely prescribed. First the deep mourning, swathed head to foot in dull black, in a special dull fabric that must not even shine, her face veiled in heavy black crape, shut away from society, permitted no color and no ornament and no gaiety at all, for a year and more. Then second mourning, the rules easing by careful degrees. Then half mourning, when at last a little gray or muted purple might creep back into her dress. The whole solemn progression stretched across years, a public performance of grief that the world watched and judged as closely as it judged everything else a woman did. A widow who came out of black too soon, who seemed too cheerful, who remarried with what the neighbors considered indecent haste, was talked about and condemned. So even her grief was not her own. Even her widowhood was a role with a costume and a script. And yet, here is the strange turn. Widowhood also brought, for the first time in a woman's whole life, a measure of real freedom. A widow was no longer under coverture. She could own property, control her own money, sign her own contracts, manage her own affairs, make her own decisions, in a way that neither the daughter nor the wife had ever been allowed. Many a Victorian woman tasted genuine independence for the very first time only when her husband was in his grave, a freedom bought at the price of her partner's life, and ringed about with black crape and 1,000 rules, but freedom of a sort all the same. It is a bleak comment on the married state of the age that, for some women, the truest liberty of their lives began on the day they became widows. And yet we must not let the law have the last word on the Victorian marriage, because the law was only its skeleton, and a great many of these unions were filled out with something the statutes knew nothing of, real deep, abiding love. For all the coverture and the obedience and the iron frame of a husband's power, countless Victorian couples were genuinely devoted to one another, true partners in everything that mattered, bound by an affection that grew richer across decades of shared life. A great many husbands cherished their wives, deferred to them in private far more than the law ever required, consulted them, depended on them, grieved them terribly when they died. A great many wives found in marriage not a cage but a home in the fullest sense, a companionship, a tenderness, a shared raising of children and weathering of sorrows that gave their lives meaning and warmth no charter of rights could measure. The Queen herself, that emblem of the age, was passionately, devotedly in love with her Albert, leaned on him utterly, and mourned him for the whole of the 40 years she outlived him. Love did not abolish the inequality. The wife who adored her husband was still, in law, very nearly his property. But love made the inequality bearable, and often invisible, and turned what might have been a prison into something that felt, to the woman inside it, very much like happiness. That is the deepest truth of the Victorian wife, and the one hardest to hold in a single thought, that the same institution could be, at one and the same time, a profound injustice and a profound source of love, and that millions of women lived their whole lives inside the contradiction, and called it, with reason, a good life. But here is the plain truth of it, said gently, as the candle burns low, you wouldn't last a day. Not the vanishing of yourself into another person at the altar, not the wedding night you were never prepared for, not the endless dangerous pregnancies your body had no say in, not the keys and the accounts and the servants and the flawless dinners, not the smiling obedience to a man who held every card, not the locked door with no key of your own. We look back at those serene wives in their domestic portraits, the angels of their quiet houses, and we imagine a life of cushioned ease. We forget how small the cushion was, and how high, and how very far the fall. And spare a thought, as you grow drowsy, for the inner life of that serene woman in the portrait, the self behind the smile, which the age gave her so little room to be. For the great unspoken cost of it all was not the keys or the calls or the lacing or even the law. It was the quiet erasure of the woman's own separate selfhood, the steady pressure to want nothing for herself, to have no ambition the marriage did not contain, no anger she might voice, no dream that pointed past the front hall. She was to pour herself out entirely into husband and children and home, and to find that pouring out so complete a fulfillment that nothing was left over to be merely, privately, herself. Many managed it, or seemed to. But the diaries and letters that survive whisper of the other thing too, of clever women stifled, of restless spirits with nowhere to go, of a loneliness at the heart of even comfortable marriages, of women who loved their families truly, and yet felt, in some unvisited room of themselves, that a whole person had been quietly folded away and put on a shelf the day they wed. That is the part no household manual could teach and no portrait could show, the ache of a self with no sphere of its own. And perhaps, lying here in the warm dark, you feel some distant kinship with her, for though the coverture is gone and the law remade, and the doors long since opened, the deeper questions she lived have never entirely left us. How much of yourself do you give to others, and how much do you keep? Where is the line between love and self-erasure, between devotion and disappearance? The Victorian wife was handed an extreme and cruel answer to those questions, and made to live inside it. We are only still, more gently, working out our own. Which is why her story is worth carrying softly down towards sleep, not to shudder at how strange her world was, but to feel, with a little tenderness, how near it still runs beneath our own, and to be kind, as you drift off, to every woman who ever folded herself small to fit the shape she was given, and loved the people she folded herself for, and was so very much more than the room they kept her in. Now let the candlelight blur, and let's leave your own front hall behind. Because the story of the Victorian wife was lived out, in the end, by real women, some who suffered inside marriages that should never have been made, some who built quiet empires of the very domestic art the age demanded of them, and some who carried the whole weight of duty and dynasty upon their shoulders, and very nearly broke beneath it. 3 real wives, to carry you gently down towards sleep. You need not hold tight to the names or the dates. Just let their lives unfold in the dark, like a long, slow story told to a drowsy listener. 3 wives, then, and 3 very different answers to the same hard question of what a woman could be inside the marriage of her age. The first took the boldest path of all. She found a marriage so wrong, so cold, so impossible, that she did the nearly unthinkable thing and undid it, and braved a society's scorn to win, on the far side, the happiness she had been denied. The second took the opposite road. She did not fight the domestic world at all, but mastered it so completely that her name became another word for the perfect wife, and was used up young by the very life she had made herself the great authority on. And the third wore the highest rank a wife could wear, and learned that not even a crown could free a woman from walls she had not built, married for a dynasty, sent into a hostile foreign court, devoted to a husband she could rarely help, and broken slowly by the weight of a duty too heavy even for an empress. The runaway, the homemaker, and the empress. 3 real wives of the Victorian age. Let their stories carry you down, one by one, into sleep. The first is a tale of a marriage so wrong it became one of the great scandals of the age, and of a woman brave enough to walk out of it and find, on the other side, a happiness she had every right to despair of ever knowing. Long before she was the contented wife of a famous painter, mother of a house full of children, she was Effie Gray, a bright, lively, beautiful young Scotswoman whose first marriage became one of the most extraordinary and most whispered about unions of the entire Victorian century. Her story cut straight to the strange heart of marriage in her age, to the silence around the wedding bed, the helplessness of a wife inside a union gone wrong, and the courage it took, against every pressure of her society, to undo a mistake that the law and the church meant to be permanent. She was born in 1828, in Scotland, into a comfortable and respectable family, and she grew into a charming, intelligent, and notably pretty young woman, sociable and warm and full of life. As a girl she had a connection to the family of a rising young man named John Ruskin, already, though still young, on his way to becoming the most celebrated art critic and one of the most influential thinkers in all of England, a man whose pronouncements on art and beauty could make or break a painter's career. There is a charming detail at the very root of the story, that Ruskin, when Effie was just a child, had written for her a fantastical fairy story, a gift to a clever little girl. Years later, when she had grown into a lovely young woman, the great man fell, or believed he fell, in love with her, and in 1848 they married. On paper it was a brilliant match, the beautiful, spirited girl and the brilliant, famous, wealthy young intellectual. It became, almost at once, a quiet catastrophe. For the marriage was never, in the most basic physical sense, a marriage at all. On their wedding night, and through all the years that followed, it was never consummated. Ruskin, for reasons that have been argued over ever since and never settled, did not, would not, could not, make Effie his wife in body. The reasons he himself later gave were strange and wounding, and the truth of it remains one of the famous mysteries of Victorian biography. But the fact was plain and devastating to the young woman living it. The reasons have been guessed at ever since, and never settled, and the guessing tells you something about the strange repressions of the age that produced them. The most famous theory, drawn from Effie's own later account of what Ruskin had said to her, is that the great connoisseur of beauty, the man who had spent his life worshipping the idealized female forms of classical sculpture and Renaissance painting, was somehow so unprepared for the reality of a living woman's body that he was repelled, disenchanted, unable to bring himself to the act. A man who could write rapturously of the beauty of a marble goddess or a painted Madonna found himself, the story goes, dismayed by an actual flesh-and-blood wife. Whether it was that, or some deep personal coldness, or a fear, or a flaw in him that we have no proper name for, no one truly knows. But the image has haunted the story for generations. The great prophet of beauty, married to one of the loveliest young women of his day, and frozen before her, unable to love her as a husband, a man so lost in the ideal that he could not meet the real. Whatever the cause, the result for Effie was the same. Years of her young life given to a marriage that was, in the most fundamental way, no marriage at all, beside a man who would not, or could not, make her his wife, and could not even explain to her why. She was a wife who was not a wife, bound to a man who held himself coldly apart from her, in a union that looked, from the outside, like an enviable success and was, on the inside, a lonely and bewildering imprisonment. And she could tell no one, for how, in an age that could not even bring itself to instruct brides about the wedding night, could a young wife possibly speak aloud the unspeakable fact that there had been no wedding night at all, not once, in years of marriage? For a time, the strange marriage carried her to some glittering places, and there at least Effie shone. The couple traveled, and lived for a spell in Venice, where Ruskin was deep in the study of the city's art and architecture for the great books he was writing, and where Effie, left largely to herself, blossomed in society. She was charming, vivacious, beautiful, fluent, and at ease among the brilliant company of the place, much admired, much sought after, a social success in her own right, while her husband buried himself in his stones and his cathedrals. It is one of the quiet ironies of her story that the world saw a dazzling, enviable young wife at the side of a great man, moving through the most cultivated society in Europe, while the reality behind the closed door was loneliness, coldness, and a marriage that did not exist. She kept the secret and played the part, as wives were trained to do, and the better she played it, the more completely alone she became. Behind the marriage, too, stood Ruskin's parents, and their presence was a heavy one. They were proud, controlling, intensely devoted to their brilliant only son, and they had never been entirely reconciled to the match. Effie found herself caught between a cold husband and his possessive parents, her own wishes counting for very little in the tight family circle that had absorbed her. She felt watched, criticized, hemmed in, her health suffering under the long strain of an impossible situation she could confide to no one. It was, in every way, the trap the Victorian marriage could become for a woman with no power of her own, bound to a man who would not love her as a husband, folded into a family that did not warm to her, and with no acceptable language even to describe what was wrong, let alone any obvious means of escape. That she eventually found both the words, and the means is the measure of her remarkable nerve. She lived in this strange limbo for years, and they were not easy ones. She found Ruskin's parents controlling and herself increasingly isolated. She suffered in her health and her spirits under the long strain of it. She was, by every sign, deeply unhappy. And Ruskin, whatever his coldness toward her as a wife, did not keep her shut away, and it was that, in the end, that opened the door to her rescue. For Ruskin was the great champion of a circle of young painters, and he took under his particular wing a brilliant young artist named John Everett Millais, one of the leading lights of the new movement that was shaking up English art. Ruskin admired Millais enormously, threw the two of them together, even arranged for Effie to sit as a model for the young painter, and for them all to travel together. The fateful episode came on a long stay in the Scottish Highlands, where the three of them, Ruskin, Effie, and Millais, went together so that the young painter could work on a portrait of the great critic, set against the wild rocks and rushing water of a Highland glen. They were thrown into close company for weeks in that remote and beautiful place, Ruskin absorbed in being painted and in his own thoughts, and Millais and Effie left much in each other's company through the long days of the work, in the rain and the heather and the quiet. And there, slowly, the thing happened that none of them had planned. The good-hearted young painter came to see the truth of the unhappy marriage before his eyes, the coldness in it, the loneliness of the bright young wife, and his admiration for Effie deepened, day by day in that glen, into a real and honorable and anguished love. And she, starved of warmth for years, found in this kind and gifted young man everything her husband had withheld. Nothing dishonorable passed between them. That was not Effie's way, and not Malay's. But by the time they came down out of the highlands, the situation had become impossible, and the seed of Effie's eventual rescue had been planted in the most romantic and most painful way imaginable. The wife, the cold husband, and the devoted young painter, all bound together by the very art that had brought them into the same house. As Effie sat for Malay, in the long quiet hours of the work, the painter came to know the warm, intelligent, suffering young woman behind the great critic's neglected wife, and to fall, honorably and helplessly, in love with her, and she with him. Now here was a situation to make all of Victorian society hold its breath. A famous critic, his beautiful young wife, the brilliant protégé painter, and a marriage that was, in secret, no marriage at all. Effie faced a choice that would have crushed a less courageous woman. She could stay, and endure, and keep the unspeakable secret, and live out her life as the respectable, miserable, untouched wife of a great man. Or she could do the very nearly unthinkable thing, expose the secret, claim her freedom, and brave the full scandal of a Victorian society that regarded the breaking of a marriage as something close to a moral catastrophe. With a courage that is genuinely breathtaking when you set it against the weight of her age, she chose freedom. She confided in her parents. She gathered her resolve, and she left Ruskin, and brought a suit to have the marriage annulled, declared null and void, on the grounds that it had never been consummated, that it had never truly been a marriage at all. It was a sensation. The annulment required her to prove the most intimate and humiliating of facts in the cold machinery of the law, to have her own body examined and certified, to make the whispered scandal of her empty marriage into a matter of public record. It was mortifying and brave, and it worked. In 1854 the marriage was annulled, and Effie Gray was free, her union to the great John Ruskin erased, as though it had never legally been. The scandal rang through society. The great critic's strange private life became the subject of endless gossip, and Effie, the woman at the center of it, had to weather all of it, the shame and the exposure and the cruel talk, the price the age extracted from any woman whose marriage became a public spectacle. But the story, almost uniquely among the marriage tragedies of her century, has a genuinely happy ending. The year after her annulment, Effie married John Everett Malay, the painter who had come to love her as she sat for him, the good and warm-hearted man who was everything her first husband had not been. And this marriage was a true one, in every sense the first had failed to be. It was happy. It was loving. It was abundantly, joyfully fruitful. Together Effie and Malay had a large family, 8 children, a busy and affectionate and prosperous household, decade upon decade of the ordinary married happiness that her first union had so strangely denied her. And she was no mere ornament to his success, but a true partner in it. She managed his busy professional life, ran his prosperous household, raised their large family, sat for him as his model in the early years, and stood beside him through the whole long climb to the very top of the art world. The very paintings for which Malay first became famous, made in the years around their meeting and their marriage, are bound up with her. She had been there at the making of his greatness, the woman in some of those early canvases, the wife behind the long career that followed. The marriage that the Victorian world had whispered about as a scandal became, in the living of it, one of the great quiet success stories of the age, a devoted, fruitful, hard-working partnership of decades, the very thing a marriage was supposed to be and so painfully often was not. Millais went on to become one of the most successful and honored painters of the entire age, and Effie was his beloved wife and partner through all of it, the mistress of a thriving home, surrounded at last by the children and the love and the life she had once had every reason to think she would never have. There was a price that lingered, for scandal in that age left a stain that even happiness could not entirely wash away. For years certain doors of the highest society stayed closed to a woman who had been at the center of so notorious an affair, and the old whispers followed her. The most pointed wound was at the very top. The Queen herself, that great arbiter of respectability, would not receive a woman whose marriage had ended in so public a scandal, and for decades Effie was barred from being formally presented at court. A small, persistent humiliation that shadowed an otherwise happy and prosperous life. A reminder that the age never entirely forgave a woman who had been part of a marital scandal, however blameless she had been. She bore it with dignity, and built her full rich life regardless, but the closed door at court stayed closed a very long time. And then, at the very end, came a kind of vindication. Her husband, John Everett Millais, rose to the very summit of his profession, laden with honors, celebrated across the nation, eventually made a baronet, his wife now entitled to be styled a lady. And as he lay dying, late in the century, it is said that he made a last request, that his Effie, after all those years, be received at court at last, the old stain wiped away, his beloved wife granted the recognition that had so long been denied her. And the wish was honored. After decades in the cold, Effie was at last formally received, the scandal forgiven, or at least set aside, her long faithful marriage and her husband's greatness finally outweighing the whispers of her youth. It came late, very late, almost too late. But it came. The brave young woman who had dared to undo a ruinous marriage, and weathered a society's scorn for it, lived to see herself vindicated, the wife of a great and honored man, restored at the end to the place her courage had cost her so dearly. There is a lesson hidden in the strange symmetry of her two marriages, and it is the lesson of the whole Victorian institution. The same woman, with the same nature, the same warmth, the same gifts, lived two utterly different married lives, one a cold and childless prison, the other a warm and fruitful happiness. What had changed was not Effie. What had changed was the man, and the luck of the match. And that is the great gamble laid bare. A Victorian wife handed her whole self, her body, her property, her future, her very legal existence, into the keeping of one man, and everything, then depended on what manner of man he turned out to be. With one, Effie withered. With the other, she flourished. She had been given no real way to know, beforehand, which fate she was choosing, and once chosen, the first time, she had been all but trapped in it forever. Her rare good fortune was not simply that her second husband was kind. It was that she had found the almost unheard of courage to escape the first and gamble again, and that the second gamble came good. Most women got only one throw of the dice, and had to live, whatever it showed. Effie threw twice, and won, and the winning is the measure of how much the first throw had cost her, and of how brave a thing it was to dare a second at all. But she had her marriage, and her children, and her contentment, and against the backdrop of so many Victorian wives trapped without remedy in unions gone cold, Effie Gray's story shines as something rare and precious. A woman who looked at a marriage that was destroying her, found the almost unimaginable courage to undo it in the full glare of a merciless society, and walk through the scandal and out the other side into a long, full, happy life. She had refused to accept that a wife's lot was simply to endure. And she had been proven gloriously right. So as you grow drowsy, hold her story gently. Effie Gray was handed, young, the very nightmare beneath the Victorian marriage ideal. A union that was a prison and a performance and a lie, with no honest way to speak of it, and no easy way out. And she found a way out anyway, and a way through, to a happiness on the far side that the angel in the house poems promised every wife, and delivered to so dreadfully few. Of all the brave things a Victorian woman could do, undoing her own marriage and surviving it may have been the bravest. Effie did it, and was happy ever after, and richly deserved to be. Let the candle gutter a little lower now. Our second wife built her quiet fame not by escaping the domestic world, but by mastering it so completely that her very name became, for generations of women, another word for the perfect wife and the well-run home. Long before her name was a household word on the spine of the most famous book of its kind in the English-speaking world, she was Isabella Mason, a clever, capable, energetic young Englishwoman who would, in a tragically short life, write the book that taught a whole nation of wives how to run their homes, and who embodied, and was very nearly consumed by, the very domestic ideal she did so much to define. Her story is the story of the Victorian wife's enormous, unsung labor, and of how young, and how fast, that labor could use a woman up. She was born in 1836, in London, into a large and bustling middle-class family, and large is the word, for through her mother's remarriage she became one of an enormous brood of children and step-siblings, and grew up, in effect, helping to manage a crowded household full of little ones long before she had a household of her own. It was an education in domestic organization that no school could have given her, and it shaped everything that followed. For the household she grew up helping to run was a vast one. Through her mother's second marriage, she became part of an enormous blended family, a great tribe of children and stepchildren that, by some accounts, ran to a score of young ones, much of the brood housed and managed under remarkable circumstances, with the eldest girls pressed into service helping to mind and organize the littler ones. Imagine a girl of 10, 12, 14, caught up in the daily logistics of feeding and clothing and minding a small regiment of children, the schedules, the meals, the endless small crises of a house full of little people. It was, in effect, an apprenticeship in household management served before she was even grown, the kind of hard practical training in organization and method, and the running of a complex domestic operation that the famous book would one day distill into print. She learned the business of the household not from a manual but from the inside, in the thick of it, as a child. And when, years later, she came to write the manual herself, she wrote with the unmistakable authority of a woman who had been managing households since before she was old enough to marry. The brisk competence that astonished her readers was no pose. It had been beaten into her, usefully, by a childhood spent as a junior officer in one of the largest domestic regiments in England. And she was, by every measure, an accomplished and capable young woman by the time she married, well brought up, sent for a time to be educated abroad as girls of her station sometimes were, returning with good French and good German, a fine hand at the piano, and the polished manners of a young lady ready for the marriage market. But beneath the accomplishments ran something less usual. A real head for work, a brisk and practical intelligence, an appetite for getting useful things done that most young ladies were never encouraged to develop. Where another girl might have folded her talents away into the decorative idleness expected of a wife, Isabella turned hers, the moment she married, straight toward labor, joining her husband's enterprise, taking up her pen, making herself genuinely useful in the world. It was, quietly, a small rebellion against the angel-in-the-house ideal, conducted not by protest but by sheer productive energy. She would be no ornament. She would be a worker. And in being one, she made herself immortal. She was well brought up, even spent time being educated abroad, returned an accomplished young woman with a good head and a brisk, practical competence, and in 1856 she married a man named Samuel Beeton, an ambitious and innovative young publisher, a pioneer of popular magazines for the rising middle class. And in that marriage of a capable woman to a publishing man lay the seed of her fame. For Samuel published, among other things, a magazine aimed at exactly the woman Isabella now was, the young middle-class wife, mistress of a modest household, anxious to do it all correctly in an age that judged her relentlessly on how well she managed her home. And Isabella, rather than sink into the role, took up her pen and went to work. She began contributing to her husband's publications, articles on cookery, on household management, on the running of a home, and from this work grew the project that would make her name immortal. Gathering recipes, advice, instructions, and information from every source she could find, soliciting them from readers, drawing on existing works, and organizing the whole vast jumble with a brilliant clarity and method, she compiled an enormous, comprehensive guide to running a Victorian household, how to cook hundreds of dishes, yes, but also how to manage servants, how to budget, how to nurse the sick, how to entertain, how to handle the law and the doctor and the tradesman, how to be, in short, the complete and capable mistress of a home. It was published, and it was a phenomenon. To grasp what she had made, you must picture the sheer scale of it. This was no slim recipe book. It was an enormous volume, well over 1,000 pages, a complete encyclopedia of the domestic life of the middle-class household. Hundreds upon hundreds of recipes, yes, each laid out with a clarity that was genuinely new, with the ingredients listed separately, the costs noted, the timings given, the number of servings, the seasons when a dish was best, all systematized in a way that earlier cookery books had never managed. But around the cookery sat a whole world of further instruction, chapters on the duties of every kind of servant, from the housekeeper to the scullery maid, on the management of money and the keeping of accounts, on the care of children and the nursing of the sick, on the giving of dinners and the seating of guests, on the law a household might encounter, on the doctor, on the treatment of poisons, and the binding of wounds. It set out to tell an anxious young wife everything she could possibly need to know to run a respectable home, and very nearly did. No wonder it sold in such staggering numbers, edition after edition, for generation after generation. And it opened with a flourish that became famous in itself, and that catches the whole spirit of the thing. The mistress of a household, Isabella wrote, was like the commander of an army or the leader of an enterprise, that the smooth running of the whole domestic machine depended on her competence, her judgment, her early rising and her good management, exactly as the fortunes of a regiment depended on its general. It was a startling and rather thrilling way to describe the role, not a meek angel drifting about the drawing-room, but a commander, an administrator, a woman of authority and method directing a complex operation. In a single image, she had dignified the despised domestic labor of millions of women, made it serious, made it skilled, made it a thing to be done well or badly, and to take pride in doing well. Whatever else the book was, it took the wife's work seriously, more seriously, in its brisk way, than all the soft poetry of angels and houses ever managed to. The book made Mrs. Beeton a name known in households across the land and far beyond for generations. It became the indispensable wedding gift, the book a new bride turned to, when she did not know how to do the thousand things her new station suddenly required of her, the authoritative voice that told the anxious young wife exactly how a proper home was run. Its opening passages famously compared the mistress of a household to the commander of an army, setting the tone for the whole enterprise, the wife as manager, as administrator, as the competent general of her domestic regiment. And though much of its material was, in the manner of such compilations of the day, gathered and adapted rather than personally invented, for she was an editor and organizer of genius more than an original cook, the achievement was entirely real. Isabella Beeton had taken the overwhelming, sprawling, anxiety-soaked job of being a Victorian wife and made it teachable, had laid it out in plain, ordered, confident instructions, and handed it to millions of women who badly needed exactly that. She had written the manual for the role her whole society demanded its women perform. What makes the achievement the more remarkable is the partnership behind it, and the speed. Isabella was no idle wife dabbling in a hobby. She was, in effect, her husband's working colleague, a genuine partner in his publishing business at a time when a wife taking any public, professional role was distinctly unusual. She wrote, she edited, she gathered and tested and organized material, she carried real responsibility in the running of the magazine, the popular periodical for women that Samuel published and into which her great work first appeared in installments. She traveled to Paris for the fashion plates. She handled correspondence. She worked, by every account, with tremendous energy and method. The famous book grew out of this ordinary hard labor, assembled piece by piece over a few short years, by a young woman in her early 20s juggling the work with the running of her own home and the bearing of her own children. It was, for its day, an extraordinary thing for a wife to be doing it all. The material itself, it must be said honestly, was very largely gathered rather than invented, and this has caused some to look askance at her fame. The recipes were solicited from readers, drawn from earlier cookery writers, adapted from existing sources, in the ordinary manner of such compilations of the time. Isabella was not a great original cook inventing dishes in her kitchen, but an editor and organizer of genius, taking a vast scattered mass of domestic knowledge and giving it shape, order, and an unmistakable confident voice. But that, in truth, was the genius, for the knowledge was useless to an anxious young wife while it lay scattered, and priceless once it was gathered, ordered, and made plain. What Isabella Beeton truly created was not the facts but the form, the clear, systematic, authoritative arrangement that turned an overwhelming subject into something a frightened bride could actually follow. It was the work of an organizer and a communicator of the first rank, and it served its readers a great deal better than mere originality would have. She had made the chaos of domestic life teachable, and a nation of wives blessed her for it. And here is the bitter irony at the center of her story, the thing that makes it linger. The woman whose name became forever a byword for the wise, mature, all-managing mistress of the household, the very image of seasoned domestic authority, was, in truth, astonishingly young, and her own married life was brief and shadowed with grief. Behind the brisk competence of the famous book lay a young wife who suffered the most common and most heartbreaking trials of Victorian marriage. She lost children young, the early babies dying in infancy, as so many Victorian babies did, a private grief carried quietly behind the public confidence. And her own life, like the lives of so many of the wives she wrote for, was cut brutally short by the central peril of the married woman's existence. In 1865, at the age of just 28, only a few years after her great book had made her name, Isabella Beeton died of an infection contracted in childbirth, the same puerperal fever that carried off so many young Victorian mothers, the dark companion of the endless pregnancies the age expected of its wives. The most famous wife in England, the calm authority on every domestic art, was dead at 28, leaving her own young children motherless. And the matter of it is worth pausing on, for it was the most ordinary tragedy of her age, and the most preventable by the standards of our own. Puerperal fever, childbed fever, was an infection of the mother in the days after a birth, and it killed young, healthy women in appalling numbers throughout the century, often spread, though they did not yet understand it, by the unwashed hands of the very doctors who attended them, carried from one bedside to the next. A woman could come safely through the great danger of the birth itself, deliver a healthy child, and then sicken and die within days of an infection no one knew how to prevent or cure, her family helpless at her bedside. It was so common as to be almost expected, a shadow over every confinement, and it took Isabella Beeton as it took so many thousands of others, a few days after childbirth, in the prime of her young life, at the very height of her growing fame. There is no escaping the dreadful symmetry of it, that the woman who had written the great manual on how a wife should manage every danger and difficulty of the household, who had included in her own famous book chapters on the care of mother and infant, was herself carried off by the central, unmanageable danger of the wife's own body, the one peril no household management could organize away. She had mapped the whole domestic world for the women of her century, and died of the one thing in it that no map could help her survive. The authority on the wife's life was claimed by the wife's death. The aftermath held its own quiet cruelties, as so often it did. Her husband, struck by grief and beset by his own financial troubles, eventually lost control of his business affairs, and the rights to the great book passed out of the family's hands, so that the fortune her famous name went on earning, year after year, decade after decade, largely flowed to others, while her own children grew up without the mother whose wisdom the whole nation was buying. And the public, for the most part, never even knew. So commanding was the voice in the book, so total its air of mature authority, that readers for generations imagined Mrs. Beeton as a stout, experienced, elderly matron, a grandmother of the kitchen and the still-room, never dreaming that the woman behind it had been a bright young wife in her 20s, that she had written it almost as a girl, and that she had been dead of the wife's own particular danger before she ever reached 30. There is something piercing in that gap between the image and the truth, and it tells you a great deal about the age. The public wanted, and imagined, a Mrs. Beeton of comfortable middle years, settled, experienced, faintly stout, the very picture of the wise matron who had seen everything and could advise on anything, the grandmother of the British kitchen. That was the authority the role required, and the book's confident voice supplied it so completely that no one questioned it. The reality, a quick, ambitious, hard-working young woman, barely out of girlhood, dead before her great fame had even fully arrived, would have unsettled the comfortable picture entirely. And so the legend of the seasoned matron grew and grew, long outliving the slight young wife who had created it, until Mrs. Beeton became less a person than an institution, a name on a spine, a household word emptied of the real, brief, striving human life behind it. The woman vanished into the wife she had taught the nation to be, which is, when you think on it, a rather exact image of what the age did to so many of its women: dissolve the living person into the role, and remembered the role, and forgot the woman. And it is worth remembering that the very book that secured her immortality earned, in the cruelest of ironies, almost nothing for her own children. Her grieving husband, never the steadiest man of business, fell into financial difficulty in the years after her death, and in the wreckage the rights to her great work passed out of the family's hands entirely. So the book went on selling by the hundreds of thousands, year upon year, decade upon decade, making fortunes for others. The children Isabella had died bearing and leaving behind grew up without the mother whose name was on every kitchen shelf in the land, and without the wealth her labor had created, which flowed instead to strangers. The most famous wife in England had written the most useful book of her century, and her own family was left with the grief and the motherless silence, while the world bought her wisdom, and never knew her name had belonged to a real and vanished girl. So let her story settle over you softly as you drift. Isabella Beeton did not rage against the domestic cage the way Effie Gray did. She did something quieter and, in its way, just as remarkable. She took the suffocating role her age assigned to women and met it head-on, with intelligence and method and sheer hard work, and made herself, out of it, one of the most famous women of her century. And yet the same role, in the end, claimed her as it claimed so many, used her up young, in the bearing of children, behind the calm and competent mask of the perfect wife. There is the whole truth of the Victorian wife's labor in that one short life, enormously capable, endlessly useful, publicly idealized, privately grieving, and gone at 28, with the world still picturing her as a wise old woman who had, in fact, never grown old at all. Let the fire sink to embers now. Our last wife wore a crown, or very nearly, and discovered that to be a royal wife, married for a dynasty, and weighed down with the hopes of two great nations, could be the loneliest and most thwarted marriage of all. Long before she was an empress mourned and an empress widowed, she was Vicky, Victoria, the Princess Royal, the eldest child of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, a brilliant, eager, warm-hearted girl, her clever father's favorite and his great hope, raised to carry her parents' ideals out into the wider world through the most Victorian of all instruments, a dynastic marriage. Her story is the story of the royal wife, married not for herself but for an alliance and an idea, sent young into a foreign court, and crushed slowly between the man she loved, the duty she carried, and the hostility of the world she had married into. She was born in 1840, the first child of the young queen and her beloved Albert, and from her earliest years she was exceptional, quick, intelligent, intellectually voracious, educated almost like a son under her father's devoted eye, soaking up his liberal ideals and his dreams of a better governed world. She was, quite simply, a prodigy, and her father knew it. Where another royal daughter might have been schooled in little beyond music, drawing, languages, and the social graces, Vicky was educated almost as a son and a future statesman, given history, politics, philosophy, serious reading, the full furniture of a thinking mind, under the close and loving direction of Prince Albert himself, who found in this brilliant eldest child the perfect vessel for everything he believed. She was precociously clever, soaking up ideas faster than her tutors could supply them, debating with her father, sharing his enthusiasms, becoming his intellectual companion as much as his daughter. It was a glorious thing, in a way, to be so educated, so taken seriously, so filled with the conviction that ideas mattered and that a person, even a woman, even a princess, might help shape the world toward the good. But it also planted in her, for a lifetime, expectations that her future would cruelly disappoint. For she was being trained, in effect, to be an influence, a force, a partner in the great work of liberal government, and then she would be married off into a court that wanted from her only sons and silence, that regarded her hard-won education and her serious opinions as precisely the irritating foreign presumption it most wished to crush. Her father gave her a mind fit to govern, and the age gave her a marriage that forbade her to use it. There is no sharper image of the Victorian woman's predicament than that gifted girl, raised to think she might change the world, sent off at 17 to a court that would spend 30 years teaching her she could not. Albert poured himself into this gifted daughter, and he had a great plan for her. The hope was that Vicky would marry into the royal house of Prussia, the rising power among the German states, and carry with her the liberal, constitutional, enlightened principles her father cherished, helping to guide a future united Germany toward the gentle, parliamentary path. She was, in other words, to be a wife with a mission, a living bridge between two nations and two visions of the future. And so, while still very young, she was betrothed to Prince Frederick of Prussia, Fritz, a tall, decent, honorable young man, and the great mercy of it was that the two of them genuinely, deeply fell in love. They married in 1858, when Vicky was just 17, and she went off to the Prussian court a teenage bride, leaving her family and her country behind to live among strangers in a foreign land. Exactly the fate of so many royal daughters, married away for the good of the dynasty into courts where they arrived knowing almost no one. The homesickness of those early years was acute, and out of it grew one of the most extraordinary records of any mother and daughter in history. For Vicky and her mother, Queen Victoria, began to write to each other, and they never really stopped, not for the whole of the next 40-odd years, until death parted them. They exchanged thousands upon thousands of letters, sometimes several in a single week, a vast unbroken conversation across the miles between England and Germany, in which the lonely young wife poured out her heart to the mother she had left behind, her struggles at the strange court, her opinions on everything under the sun, her joys and griefs, and the daily texture of her exile. It is from this mountain of letters that we know her so intimately, a clever, passionate, opinionated, vulnerable woman, forever a little English in a land that would not let her forget it, forever reaching back across the channel toward the family and the country she had been sent away from at 17. The correspondence is a monument to a particular kind of female endurance, the married-away daughter, keeping her truest self alive in ink, in a homesickness that never entirely healed across 4 decades in a foreign land. For the Prussia she had come to was, in almost every way, the opposite of the warm, liberal, art-loving home her father had built. It was stiff, formal, military, suspicious of the clever foreign girl and her English ways, and her inconvenient habit of having opinions. Vicky did not help herself, perhaps. She was proud of her father's ideals, and not at all inclined to keep them quiet, and she let the rigid Prussian court see too plainly that she thought it backward and hoped to improve it. The court repaid her with a cold and lasting hostility. She was the Englishwoman, the outsider, watched and resented and quietly thwarted at every turn, her influence feared, her foreignness never forgiven. A royal wife was supposed to dissolve herself into her husband's country and become wholly its creature. Vicky never quite could, and never quite wanted to, and she paid for that integrity with decades of isolation in the midst of a court that had absorbed her body but never her heart. And here the trouble began. For the Prussian court was rigid, militaristic, conservative, and intensely proud, and it regarded its clever young English princess with deep suspicion. Vicky arrived full of her father's liberal ideals, and her own quick opinions, English to the bone and not inclined to hide it, and the stiff Prussian establishment bristled at the foreign girl who seemed to think she could reform them. She was watched, criticized, isolated, her every English habit noted and resented, her attempts to influence things in the liberal direction her father had dreamed of ran headlong into the iron conservatism of the court and, above all, into the towering figure of Otto von Bismarck, the ruthless statesman who was busy uniting Germany by blood and iron, by exactly the opposite of everything Vicky and her father believed. Against Bismarck's cold genius, the hopes of the idealistic young princess and her gentle husband had very little chance. And her trials as a wife and mother began early and cut deep. Her first child, the son who would one day become Kaiser Wilhelm II, the emperor whose reign would end in the catastrophe of the First World War, was born after a terrible, dangerous labor that left the infant with a withered, paralyzed arm, an injury that marked him for life. The birth itself nearly killed them both. It was a breech delivery. The baby turned the wrong way, the most perilous kind of birth in an age with so little to offer a mother in difficulty, and in the long, desperate struggle to deliver him, the child's arm was injured beyond repair, the nerves damaged, so that his left arm never grew properly, and remained withered and all but useless for the whole of his life. That a mother and child survived such a labor at all was something close to a miracle, that the child was the future Kaiser, and that his damaged body would haunt his proud and difficult character ever after, gave the ordeal a long and fateful shadow. Vicky, young and frightened and far from her own mother, had faced the central terror of every Victorian wife, the dangerous childbed, at its very worst, and carried away from it both her firstborn son and a private guilt and grief over his injury that would tangle their relationship for decades. The very first act of her motherhood had been a brush with death and a lifelong wound, and it set the pattern of heartbreak that her eldest son would go on tracing for the rest of her days. It was the kind of birth that killed many women, and it cast a long shadow. The damaged arm, the difficult relationship that grew between the anxious, loving, demanding mother and the proud, resentful, increasingly headstrong son. For Wilhelm grew up to reject much of what his mother stood for, to embrace the militaristic Prussian spirit she had hoped to soften, and to turn, in time, coldly against her, the bitterest of all a mother's defeats, to raise a child who becomes the champion of everything you fought against. Vicky bore many children and loved them fiercely, but in her eldest son, the future Kaiser, she met a heartbreak that would darken her whole later life. And the heartbreak was not hers alone, though she did not live to see its full size. For the son who rejected his mother's gentle liberal vision, who embraced instead the swagger and the militarism and the iron pride of the Prussia she had hoped to soften, grew up to be the Kaiser Wilhelm whose vanity and bluster and love of armies helped steer Europe, in time, toward the catastrophe of the Great War. The very war that would consume a generation, that would set Vicky's two countries, her native England and her adopted Germany, at each other's throats across the trenches, was made in part by the character of the son she had failed to reach. She had been sent to Prussia all those years before, precisely to plant English liberalism in German soil and help the two great nations grow together in peace. She had given her whole life to that mission. And the chief fruit of her marriage, her own firstborn son, became instead one of the architects of the disaster that tore the two nations apart. No mother could have borne the full knowledge of it. Mercifully, she died before the worst came. But the shape of the tragedy was already there in her lifetime, plain in the cold, proud son who turned from everything she loved, the most complete defeat imaginable of a wife and mother who had poured herself, body and soul, into a hope that her own child would grow up to destroy. It was not that she was a poor mother, or an unloving one, quite the opposite. Vicky bore a large family, sons and daughters both, and she loved them with the same fierce, anxious, demanding intensity she brought to everything. She fretted over their educations, their healths, their marriages, their characters, pouring into them the high hopes and the strong opinions that were so much a part of her. With several of her children she had warm and loving bonds that lasted all her life. But the pattern of her own life repeated itself, as it so often did down the royal generations. Her daughters, in their turn, were married off across the courts of Europe for the good of dynasty and alliance, sent away, as she had been sent away, to make their own homes among strangers and learn the same hard lessons of the royal wife. She had become, like her mother before her, a hub of the great interrelated family that sat upon the thrones of Europe, the grandmother and great-aunt of kings and queens and emperors yet to come. And there is a terrible irony folded into that, too, that this woman who had given her life to the cause of peace between nations was knitted by blood into nearly every throne that would, within a generation of her death, hurl those nations into the bloodiest war the world had yet seen, cousins commanding the armies that slaughtered one another's young men. The royal marriages were meant to bind Europe together in a great peaceable family. They bound it together, in the end, only in the way a single family can be bound across a bitter and murderous quarrel. Vicky did not live to see it. But she had felt its first cold winds all her life, in the rise of the very forces, and the very sun she had been sent to soften, and had not been able to. Through all of it, the one steady light was her marriage. Whatever the hostility of the court, whatever the defeats at Bismarck's hands, Vicky and Fritz loved each other truly and stood together, two liberal hearts in a cold conservative world, waiting and hoping for the day Fritz would at last come to the throne and they could, together, guide their nation toward the better future they both believed in. They waited for decades. And when the day finally came, it came already poisoned. For by the time Fritz at last became Emperor of Germany, in 1888, he was a dying man, stricken with a cancer of the throat that had already all but silenced him. He reigned for 99 days, 3 short months of a crown they had waited a lifetime for, too ill to accomplish any of the great liberal reforms they had dreamed of together, fading before his wife's eyes. The cruelty of the timing is almost unbearable to contemplate. For 30 years Vicky and Fritz had waited through the long reign of his father, waited through the rise of Bismarck, waited and hoped and held to their dream that when Fritz's day came they would at last turn Germany toward the gentler, freer future they both believed in. And his day came only as the cancer was already killing him. The illness had taken his throat, and with it his voice, so that the new emperor could barely speak, and communicated in his last reign by writing on slips of paper. There had been a bitter controversy over his treatment. The German doctors and an English specialist disagreeing over what the growth was and how it should be handled, the whole sad business tangled up with the national rivalry that shadowed Vicky's entire life. Was the foreign-influenced empress, people muttered, somehow to blame? With her English physician? She nursed him devotedly through it all, this dying man who was her husband and her one ally, and the keeper of their shared dream. And she watched the throne they had waited a lifetime for become merely the stage of his death. 99 days. Then he was gone, in the summer of 1888, and everything she had married for and hoped for and endured 30 years of cold exile to reach died in the same bed. And then he died, and Vicky's whole life's purpose died with him. The gentle, decent husband gone, the liberal hope extinguished, and the throne passing at once to her own son Wilhelm, who had no intention of carrying on his parents' vision, and who treated his grieving mother with coldness and suspicion in the very hour of her loss. Her widowhood was lonely and embittered and sad. The Empress Frederick, as she was now styled, found herself sidelined, distrusted, watched, her influence gone, her son the Emperor turned against her, her adopted country having never truly accepted her, and now having no more use for her at all. In the very days after Fritz's death, her son Wilhelm, now the Kaiser, had soldiers surround their home in search of his parents' private papers, fearing, it was said, what his liberal mother and father might have written that he would rather the world not see. It was a brutal beginning to her widowhood. The grieving empress treated almost as a suspect by her own son in the first hours of her loss, the cold triumph of everything she had spent her life opposing. She withdrew, in time, to build herself a refuge, a beautiful country house she filled with art and books and the English comforts of her heart, a last small kingdom of her own taste and making, far from the court that had never wanted her. There she lived out her widowhood among her treasures and her memories and her correspondence, still writing, still thinking, still grieving the husband and the future she had lost. She had been, all her life, a woman of real cultivation and intelligence, a patron of artists, a collector, a mind that might have done great things in a world that let women do them. In her widowhood, she gathered those consolations around her as best she could. She had been, in truth, a woman well ahead of her age, interested in the education of girls, in the care of the sick, in social reform, in art and ideas of every kind, full of the conviction that the world could be made kinder and better, and that she might help to make it so. In another time, with another life, she might have been a great force for good in her own right, a reformer, a patron, a power. Her age gave her instead a single channel for all that energy, marriage, and through marriage influence, and through influence nothing, because the influence was forever blocked. So the great gifts turned inward and soured into frustration, the reforming spirit beating itself against walls that would not yield, until there was little left to do with all the thwarted brilliance, but collect beautiful things and write long letters, and grieve for what might have been. It is one of the quiet tragedies of her century, repeated in countless lesser lives. The gifted woman with nowhere to put her gifts, pouring a force that might have moved nations into the narrow vessel of a wife's permitted life, and watching it go nowhere at all. But the isolation was deep, and the breach with her imperial son never truly healed, and the old hostility of the country closed over her like water. And then came the last and most fitting cruelty of a life so full of them. She fell ill with cancer, as her husband had, a slow and agonizing cancer that she bore through her final years with extraordinary courage and a stoic determination to spare her family the worst of it, even keeping the full gravity of her suffering hidden as long as she could. She had been sent abroad young to carry a great dream into a foreign land, and she had spent her whole married life beating against walls that would not move, sustained only by her husband, and now even he was gone. She died in 1901, just months after the death of her own mother, Queen Victoria. The two of them, mother and daughter, the old queen and the tragic empress, passing out of the world within the same year, at the close of the century they had both so completely belonged to. So let her story be the last you carried down into sleep. Vicky was the royal wife in its purest and most punishing form, married young for a dynasty and a dream, sent into a foreign court that never warmed to her, bound to a husband she truly loved but could almost never help, mother to a son who broke her heart, and left at the end a widowed empress mourning a 99-day reign and a lifetime of thwarted hope. She had been given everything a woman of her age could be given: rank, intellect, a loving marriage, a great mission, and the world had still, in the end, defeated her at nearly every turn. There is no clearer proof that even at the very summit, even with a crown in reach, the Victorian wife's life was lived inside walls she had not built and could not move. A clever, loving, dutiful woman, pouring her whole self into a marriage and a mission, and finding the age too hard and too heavy, even for an empress. And there our journey ends for tonight. We began this evening at an altar, vanishing quietly into another person with a single word, and we leave it in the company of three real wives who lived out the truth beneath the ideal. Effie Gray, who found the courage to undo a marriage that was destroying her and won her happiness at last. Isabella Beeton, who mastered the domestic art so completely that her name outlived her by a century, and who paid for the wife's life with her own at 28. And Vicky, the empress, who carried a dynasty's whole hope into a foreign land and was broken, gently and thoroughly, by the weight of it. Each of them a wife. Each of them so very much more than the law and the age would ever let her be. Lie quietly a moment, and hold the three of them together, for laid side by side, they map the whole country of the Victorian wife. Effie Gray stands at one border, the woman who refused, who looked at a marriage that was unmaking her and found the courage to break it and choose again, and so escaped into the happiness the age promised everyone and gave to so few. Isabella Beeton stands at the center, the woman who neither refused nor was crushed, but mastered the role so completely that she taught it to a nation, and was quietly consumed by it, dead at 28 behind the calm authority of her famous name. And Vicky, the empress, stands at the far border, the woman who had everything, rank and intellect and a loving husband and a great mission, and was defeated anyway, slowly and thoroughly, by walls that even a crown could not move. Escape, mastery, and defeat. Three women given the same narrow part to play, who played it three different ways, and every one of whom was larger than the part. And beneath their three different fates ran the same single truth this whole evening has circled, that to be a wife in that age was to hand your whole self into another's keeping, and to discover that everything, your happiness, your safety, your very freedom to be a person at all, then turned on luck, and law, and the character of one man. They are at rest now, all three, beyond the keys, and the calling cards, and the long performance of being good. And so soon will you be. So let the candles burn down now, and the wedding silver gleam softly in the dark, and the quiet houses of all those vanished wives settle into the night. There is nothing left to manage tonight, no dinner to oversee, no keys to carry, no one to obey, no role to perform. You may set it all down, the duty, the smiling, the endless careful work of being good, and simply be, here in the warm dark, exactly as you are, which is enough. Think, if it soothes you, of how gently it all comes to rest in the end. The wedding silver and the calling cards, the keys and the account books, the long dinners and the careful curtsies, the whole vast machinery of being a proper wife. All of it quiet now, all of those busy hands long stilled, all those serene women in their portraits sleeping the same deep sleep at last, the runaway and the homemaker and the empress alike. No more dinners to give, no more selves to fold away, nothing left to manage or perform. There is a deep kindness in that thought, if you let it settle over you. Tonight there is no household resting on your shoulders, no husband to please, no role you must play, no verdict pending on whether you have been good enough. There is only the warm dark, and your slow breathing, and the soft weight of the blankets, and the quiet ghosts of all those vanished wives keeping you gentle company at the edge of the firelight, asking nothing of you at all as you drift. Let your breathing slow. Let your shoulders sink into the pillows. Let the soft dark settle over you like a blanket drawn up to your chin. The bright, demanding, complicated world can wait until morning. It always does. Sleep now. Rest easy, wherever you are, whatever the hour. And when you're ready, drift off gently into your own quiet dreams. I'll be here again tomorrow night, with another story from the soft, candlelit past, to keep you company in the dark. Until then, sweet dreams.